Yeah, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really a great pleasure to be here at the University of Oxford today. And walking down Oxford High Street this morning, I was reminded of a picture by the great English painter William Turner. I'm sure you are familiar with this painting. It is entitled High Street, Oxford. It depicts University College on the left, All Souls College on the right, and Carfax Tower in the distance. And on my morning walk, I was startled by how little actually has changed since the 19th century when the painting was first exhibited. The buildings are still in place, and they appear very well kept. And yet, at the same time, so much has changed. There are buses, cabs, modern amenities. Many of you have obviously not come by bike, and a lot of other changes have happened. But it is precisely this sort of progress which has been fueling another type of change, climate change. Let's talk about the costs of climate change. Today, average temperatures are higher than they were 200 years ago, and not only in the UK, globally. The past decade has been the warmest on record. Our planet is on average more than 1 degree Celsius warmer today than in the days when Turner painted his picture. What is more, ocean surface temperature are at record highs. And the ocean waters surrounding the UK, sea surface temperatures are running as high as 5 degrees Celsius above normal. And the effect of these developments are clearly visible. More frequent and severe weather events, degradation of fertile land, and the loss of biodiversity. Last year alone, natural disasters resulted in worldwide losses of about 270 billion US dollars, according to a study by Munich Re. Let's talk about climate financing. Clearly, climate financing needs to increase significantly, and we heard that today. But not only for risk mitigation, but also for adaptation to the real normal. While risk mitigation largely refers to greenhouse gas reductions, adaptation means things such as resilient infrastructure, sturdy housing, and heat-resistant food, especially crops. Estimates of the global investment needed, on the one hand, to achieve Paris Agreement temperature and at the same time adaptation goals range between 3 and 6 trillion US dollars each year through to 2050. And that's a really tall number. Currently, mitigation finance continues to dominate at more than 90% of the total climate finance. By contrast, far less capital goes into adaptation finance, where there's still very little private sector involvement. And especially in the global south, where the immediate effects of climate change are more acute than around here. But please, don't get me wrong. Focusing on transformation and on risk mitigation is important. Our first priority is to stop global warming. But deprioritization of adaptation is rather short-sighted. The reason being that climate crisis does not stop at national borders. The failure to adapt to a changing climate can destroy livelihoods. It can lead to famine, to geopolitical tensions, as we just see now, and finally to significant migrations. To deprioritize adaptation could hence make the global north more vulnerable too. In my speech today, I would focus on climate financing for mitigation and adaptation. But it is also and especially about the power of collaboration and of win-win partnerships between the global south and the global north. Take the case of green hydrogen. In simple words, the global north needs to meet its climate targets, and it needs to change to fossil-free energy. Regions in the global south have the potential to produce it at scale. If pursued as a partnership of equals, investments in green hydrogen could benefit both sides by fostering sustainable growth locally and at the same time enhancing green energy supply for the global north. In the following, I will outline 3 ways to scale up green finance also and especially in the global south. Let's talk about blended finance, about debt for nature swaps, and about voluntary carbon markets. They are by no means cure-alls, but they will move us one step closer towards meeting the global financing needs. Let's start with blended finance. There are several impediments to the deployment of private capital in developing and emerging economies. Among them, political risk, an unstable institutional framework, and foreign exchange risk. As a result, the cost of capital for a typical utility-scale solar project can be 2 to 3 times higher in emerging countries than in advanced economies. Blended finance can be a strategic tool to bridge the financing gap and scale up private investment. It combines public and philanthropic money with private money. Multilateral development banks, or better known as MDBs in short, are instrumental in this regard. They are well experienced, they can offer resources and credibility, they are able to provide tailor-made financing by giving either guarantees or taking the first loss pieces. And their involvement often comes with a halo effect or an implicit risk mitigation. However, MDBs, or the multilateral development banks' resources, are also limited. Securitization can be one way to get private investors on board and give the MDBs more room for lending. And there's a good example how it can work. The room to run transaction of the African Development Bank is a very good example. And this deal, and the room to run deal, structured as a synthetic securitization, freed up an additional fund of $650 million with no further capital being required from shareholders. The concept of public-private partnership is not new, but it is only one yet very important piece of the puzzle. However, It can give a real boost to sustainable financing. This way, every public dollar or pound can have an impact many times over. Besides blended finance, there are other innovative avenues worth exploring as a way of scaling up climate financing, especially in developing economies which often lack the fiscal means to provide basic services. 34 out of 59 developing economies most vulnerable to climate change are also at risk of fiscal crisis. Debt for nature swaps can be one way to at least free some fiscal space to combat climate change and fund resilience. Debt for nature swaps restructure portions of a country's debt and offer debt relief in return for environmental commitments by the receiving country. This means it benefits the climate not just locally, but globally as well. And the world's largest debt for nature swap to date just happened in Ecuador in June this year, a couple of weeks ago. In return, the Ecuadorian government committed to invest in protecting the endangered Galapagos Islands. And in a sign of growing momentum, also the European Investment Bank is planning to launch its first debt for nature swap this year, with the aim of addressing the loss of biodiversity. Again, debt for nature swaps aren't a miracle cure. Negotiations can be long and arduous. Additional environmental gains can be hard to assess. Nevertheless, when negotiations take place on an equal footing, they can play their part in scaling up climate financing, especially in the global south. Ladies and gentlemen, let's finally also talk about voluntary carbon markets. They are another emerging way of mobilizing private capital for climate action. They offer companies, institutions, and people the opportunity to purchase carbon credits to offset hard-to-abate emissions. Each carbon credit is equal to 1 ton of carbon equivalent removed from the atmosphere. Project developers across the world, and particularly in the global south, sell carbon credits to fund emission reduction projects, such as activities protecting endangered rainforests or technologies capturing carbon from the atmosphere. Those projects often come with additional benefits, gains in biodiversity, public health, and jobs. Despite solid growth, the voluntary carbon market is still in its infancy. Growth remains constrained by an absence of industry standards, a lack of independent monitoring, and a high market fragmentation. I therefore welcome initiatives to strengthen the integrity and the functionality of carbon credit markets. In a nutshell, transparency and trust are key. I really looking forward to hear fresh insights on how these existing challenges can be tackled in today's afternoon session. I know you will be talking also about voluntary carbon credit markets. After all, these markets would facilitate the flow of private capital, at least to the global south. It is estimated that Africa alone could generate up to 6 billion in additional capital from carbon credits by 2030. Before I conclude, allow me to make one last point. Carbon credits must never be an excuse for companies or for individuals not to cut their own emissions as far as possible. So let me now conclude. Ladies and gentlemen, protecting the climate is the most pressing task of our time. Climate financing needs to increase significantly in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. More engagement from private investors is key, especially in the global south, where the immediate effects of climate change are already endangering the livelihoods of millions of people. Blended finance can be an efficient tool to bridge the financing gap and scale up private investments. Multi-development banks are instrumental in this regard. So are partnerships of equals and advocacy. Both topics will also feature prominently on my agenda when I will take over the NGFS presidency from Ravi Menon early next year. Ravi is doing a tremendous job in broadening the membership of the NGFS, of the network. For those who are not familiar with it, it's a network of central bankers and supervisors. Now we are having, I think, 130 members, so 130 central banks and supervisors globally. I myself will not relent in campaigning for an inclusive transition and an open dialogue where all parties interact on an equal footing. Allow me to quote the French President Emmanuel Macron. No country should have to choose between reducing poverty and protecting the planet. Ladies and gentlemen, this hall is full of bright and very influential people. Let us make the most of this conference. Let us work together on an inclusive transition and a more sustainable planet, so that we will still be able to recognize and enjoy Oxford High Street in the future. Thank you very much.